what I'm talking about today is why it's hard to find an analytics engineer. And this is not just from my perspective, this is also from the perspective of in-house technical recruiters and also from folks who work in recruiting agencies, as well as a couple of managers that I spoke to who have analytics teams. I definitely spoke to a bunch of managers while I was interviewing, but that's a little separate story. So, why is it? You might be wondering who I am. So just to give a little bit of context, and if you don't know that meme, it's Kazoo Kid. I hope this is nostalgic for some of you. I've been project managing a job search for the last month. I've been in 12 different pipelines, I've had 7 technical interviews, and I did 6 on-sites. So I think it's fair to say I have a good amount of data on this topic. I'm currently an analytics engineer, and there's a couple of fun facts about myself there, that I'm a DBT fan, that I also like Snowflake, and my pronouns are she and her, just for keeping that in mind. So the way that I'm going to go through with this is just a bit of process breakdown, and that's going to follow the process that I went through when I was looking for opportunities as well as talking to folks. The first thing that I did was look for roles that aligned with my career goals. For me, that was looking for a lot of autonomy in a role, looking for a manager who is going to provide continuous feedback for improvement, and really looking for opportunities that if they weren't very clearly written out, that they had the opportunity, they had a chance to potentially be a job that I would really enjoy and like have a lot of room for growth in. The next thing that I did throughout all of my processes was reaching out to a manager, having initial conversations with them, asking what type of manager they are, how they like to give feedback, how they deal with failure, as well as then having a following recruiter call and then a technical screen, or if there wasn't a technical screen, I would go straight to an on-site for 3 to 4 hours and then have a technical screen on-site. And this presentation is going to sort of follow that order and walk you through how I went about each of those things. So a little bit of sample data and where I found success. If you guys aren't in the DBT Slack group, that's a fantastic place to either post jobs or look for folks who have posted about themselves being available for new opportunities. Locally Optimistic is another great Slack group, and there's a ton of other Slack groups out there for whether it's GIS data or like any type of data science Slack group. I'd really encourage you to go out there and like check if that Slack group has a jobs channel, because those are great places to look. Another great place to look is Meetups. So if you haven't tried those yet, I would hope that I highly recommend it, very highly recommend it. The other thing is just having casual coffee meets with people. One thing that I did that helped was just setting up a couple of coffee meets with folks that are in the Events New York City channel, in the DBT Slack, and just meeting people and networking was a great way to find folks that were looking for analytics engineers or knew someone that was looking. So if you aren't from New York City and you came here today, or if you are from New York City, I would really recommend posting in like the events channel, just saying, hey, other people that use DBT or other people that use Want to DBT, do you want to meet up? Do you want to just have a conversation? And a lot of the conversations I had were really cool and just a great way to network and find out about where other companies are at this point in time. And then you have your more traditional methods like posting on LinkedIn, reaching out to your network, just asking people if they know anyone, asking them if they have someone they'd recommend. Pretty standard stuff. And then the next thing that I noticed and heard a lot of feedback from, especially from technical recruiters, is that it's really difficult to screen for technical folks. Analytics in particular is relatively new, so you can't just go on LinkedIn and find a resume that perfectly fits like your analytics needs. You can be an analyst and do nothing but advanced Excel. You can be an analyst that does machine learning. So it's very much gray area in terms of like looking at titles and figuring out what that actually means. So I would advise anyone who's looking and anyone who's looking for a candidate or a new role to really be thoughtful about what they're looking for and looking at things like stack, things like what their roadmap is, do they have to re-platform? These are all really important things to think about, because especially with respect to re-platforming, you'd want to think about whether you're hiring for data as a product or data as a service. If anyone doesn't know like data as a product versus data as a service, would you please raise your hand? Okay, so data as a product, you can think of that as setting the foundation for your analytics platform, really setting up all your ETL pipelines, getting that organized. If you need an orchestrator for a tool like dbt, getting that set up and having it set up in a way that is going to scale and grow with your business. And then data as a product really means that the end product that you're handing off is going to be just the data itself. So your goal is to really get clean data that can be used for someone to ingest, or if they want to create a report from it in like Excel, they can do that because it's already clean to the point that it's very usable. Whereas data as a service is more focused on, I would compare it more to like continuous integration, where you have this feedback and this conversation with stakeholders, and their feedback is constantly informing how you continue to model your data and how you continue to improve your services. So it's kind of like once you have data as a platform, you're building up data as a service on top of that. Does that make sense, everyone? Cool. And then something that I put a lot of thought into as I was taking technical interviews, because for some reason, when I started my job search, I was like, this is a great time to collect data for a meetup talk. As you do. I thought a lot about the technical interviews that people were giving. And this was a combination of whether they were vague or very directed, and as well as whether they were synchronous or asynchronous in their communication. So the thing about whether you're giving a directed or vague technical interview, like a very, very directed one would be a coding challenge. But like the trade-offs there are that while you get to find out whether someone is very good at SQL in a particular dialect or not, you miss out on being able to see their problem-solving process. And you're only getting a very narrow idea of what they're like as a candidate. Because let's be real, everybody here is familiar with Google and Stack Overflow. I think it's not realistic to say that like a candidate should be able to put this in precise syntax exactly in an hour. The other thing is, like, if you're not giving an as directed technical test, let's say you give them a little bit of context, you give them a little bit of sample data, and then what you do is you say, okay, I am stepping into the role of a product manager, I want to know these metrics, how would you find them for me? I think that that's fine, and like having room to communicate what assumptions are and what the scope of this is and what their goal ultimately is as a stakeholder. If your candidate is asking questions about these things, I think that very realistic and reflective of how a team works. And those are good signs to keep in mind. Versus like the very, very, very vague type of test is just, here's data, get creative. And the problem with that, if you want to give someone like the ability to just grab something and run with it, you know, and that's really what you're looking for in a candidate, then sure, that can be your technical test. But for most folks who are looking for at least some structure, I think that doesn't give you a very good idea of what it's like to work with a company, unless it's very much a hands-off opportunity. And then the huge thing that influences a technical test is whether you're doing it live, so synchronous communication, or whether you're doing it via email, or you're having like an updated, yeah, I guess it's only really live or email, like a take-home homework. The thing is that if you're doing it over email, right, you want to make sure that your candidate is able to ask questions in a timely manner and you're able to respond in a timely manner. Because realistically, if they can't scope out what the problem is and you gave a really vague interview question like, here's data, I want to know insights, it's not going to, one, be reflective of a real situation where you're taking in a lot of stakeholder feedback. And even if they do turn around quickly, I guess the question still remains is, how did they scope it? What assumptions did they make and why? I think that that should be an open conversation that you're having with your stakeholders, rather than just throwing things out to the universe and saying that, like, I think that these are the good assumptions. Yes, you can have good assumptions. Yes, these tests can work out, but I am hugely in favor of synchronous tests because you have the opportunity to really work with someone, get feedback, and it's as if you're on a real team. Some of the interviews that were technical interviews that I really liked were the ones where I got to sit down with someone, go through code, read it, give my opinions on why the code was structured well or why syntax could be better or how I would have improved it, as well as ones where I was told to write an exercise and ask questions and tell them what assumptions I was making as I was going through a thought-building process of how I would organize data, how I would solve a problem, and how I would approach my stakeholders. I think that that reflects the situation that most of us are in when it comes to working with our stakeholders, whether your stakeholders are analysts or they're folks who are C-level executives who are just looking for an at-a-glance report. And then the last thing to keep in mind would be thinking about how clearly your role is defined. And for this, I talked to a couple of in-house technical recruiters, and it's a continuous process of really figuring out how you're looking at the role, what you're looking for, and maybe reevaluating your requisites if you're not finding that many candidates. Well, yes, I do think that you should be very thoughtful about what skills you need. It's also important to figure out what exactly you're looking for. Analytics engineering is a hot topic right now, but it doesn't mean there's sort of one fits all answer to this. You can find a software engineer pretty easily. You can find a front-end web developer. Those have a standard set of skills and experience, but to the certain degree that you can, you try to narrow down where you expect the role to be, whether it's leaning more to the data eng side or it's leaning more to the data analytics side. And then just also considering what type of manager that you are, because that's going to largely inform a lot of the amount of freedom and the amount of responsibilities the role is going to take on. So for recruiter perspectives, this came from a couple of in-house technical recruiters as well as speaking to a handful of recruiting agencies who focus on analytics. So like I mentioned earlier, analytics is a relatively new field. It's very difficult to find one person who just fits this mold or fits this title. Title itself is vague. People's job titles don't necessarily say what they do, especially in analytics. It's important to look for skills. And speaking with the technical recruiters that I found to be really excelling at what they were doing, something that they did was they cast a broad net and narrowed down and then worked with the hiring manager to really narrow down and see what fit the best. The things that were important to keep in mind is that it is a refining process. Nobody really knows exactly what they're looking for, but I think that your culture and your team is going to inform that as you move on. It's going to help you to work with your technical recruiter and really narrow that down. The other thing that was a big part of searching was that because analytics engineering and on the technical side of just analytics in general is it's new, and there's a lot of flexibility and what skills someone can have that would make them a great analyst or an analytics engineer. There's a lot of demand but not so many candidates. So to just flip the problem on its head, not just thinking about why you should consider a candidate, but for candidates who are in multiple pipelines, why should they consider you? And then the last thing that really made a couple of companies stand out was a focus on candidate feedback. I think that this is one of the things that really made the interview pipeline stand out for maybe 2 or 3 companies out of all the ones I interviewed with, was that they looked for candidate feedback and they were looking to make sure that they were on the mark in terms of how other people were doing their technical interviews, how other people were going in pipeline. Was this a job that the candidate really wanted? Was it a culture fit? Was it also one that made sense in terms of timelines for what the candidate was working with? Were they really excited about the opportunity, or were they lagging behind in ones that they weren't as interested in? And I think that that's what will really improve your process and really keep you up to date and also attract a lot of talent, is seeing that you're a company that really cares and focuses on that pipeline and on getting people who are genuine and just accepting feedback about your process and trying to improve it always. I think that's something that you should take away as a learning lesson for all of us. And then the next thing I would suggest is that if you can't find your ideal candidate, to look for a mindset and not a skill set. I say that because a year ago, I had never heard of DBT or seen it in my life. And then about 8 months later, I was a top contributor to the DBT repo at my company. And I think that what enabled me to do that was having a certain mindset. Having the mindset that I could grow into this, I'd be excited to learn, and also having the mindset of breaking a problem down. I think for folks that have come from STEM fields, that's very much, how do you break this problem down into little pieces? I like to pose it as, how do you make the peanut butter jelly sandwich? It's not just smashing 2 pieces of bread together. You have to get the bread, and then open the bread, and then spread the peanut butter, yada, yada, yada. Really think about breaking down the problem so that you can put it into its simplest steps, and then compose it into a very nice SQL query. And the other thing is thinking about like their experience with SQL or like Python, as well as thinking about their ability to figure things out on their own. I think that's something that's really important and that I've seen from growth in my teammates as well as myself is people who make the decision to sit down when they don't understand something and just try it for a little while, but also understand that you can't be staring at the same problem for 5 hours, and there is a point where you time box and ask for help. I would say that folks who are really excited about learning, excited to take feedback and turn it into an actual plan for them to improve are all really great things that enable someone to really grow into an analytics engineering role, even without experience with DBT or Python. So, ways that you can build up an analytics engineer. This was a resource that I did not have. The wonderful Claire has put this together, and it launched a couple of weeks ago. It is so fantastic. And yes, I'm not sponsored by them or anything. I just really like this because I was lacking this when I started, and I was like, oh God, that would have made my life so much easier. But one of the big challenges that I had when I was starting to learn DBT was that I didn't really have an example to apply it to. We had an existing DBT repo, we had existing models, we had it plugged into Looker, but I didn't have a way to connect the two and build something from scratch because everything was already built, and I wasn't at the point that I understood DBT well enough that I could start building models from scratch. And I think that this exercise really accomplishes that really well. So shout out to DBT and Claire for putting this together. It's great. So these are my cats. Yeah, so another big topic that I feel that people don't talk about enough is salary. Yeah, cue awkwardness in the room. So one thing that I noticed talking to a handful of companies, as well as talking to a variety of managers of analytics teams, thankfully not ones that I was interviewing with, that would have been nerve-wracking, was about salary. And right now, from what I've seen in the market and also talking to a variety of in-house recruiters and managers, is that right now, for someone who has some analytics engineering skills, it's pretty similar to data engineering skills and data engineering asks. The price range seems to be about 120 to 130. Obviously, there's different perks, there's different people that have different situations, different wants and needs. Money isn't everything to everyone, but that's just what I'm seeing right now from my experience. And for those of you who want to save some money, this is my other cat, because I didn't want to steal a photo from the internet and not credit it. And I couldn't find an appropriate one either. For those of you who want to save some money, this one way to think about it is hiring someone who can grow into an analytics engineer. Someone who's maybe had some SQL experience but hasn't really touched Python, or maybe they've heard of DBT but haven't used it in their role yet. And they're more on the junior side, maybe 1 to 2 years of analytics experience. From my experience, having that skill set and talking to folks back when I did have that skill set about 2 years ago, I would say that this is probably more of an 80 to 100 range if you want to take the opportunity to really train someone up. And there are tons of great resources out there to train someone up, especially with DBT growing out. And just that, like, there's so many different ways that you can approach DBT now. I think that's a great opportunity to have someone who's really excited to grow into a role that's very new and very much evolving. And now I'd like to open up the floor for questions, comments, or jokes.